They called her the Quiet Widow. She came to Blackthistle in the winter of '73, riding behind the freight wagon like a ghost clinging to its own echo. No one saw her speak when she arrived. No one remembered her name, though they claimed she offered one once, short and plain, maybe Ruth or June, something that dissolved on the tongue like smoke. She took up a corner room at the edge of the Red Lantern Saloon, where the rent was cheap and the walls thin. She paid in silver coins, clean and hard-earned, and cooked her own beans over a dented tin stove. She did not take to drink, nor music, nor the company of the town's regulars. She sat most days at the same crooked table by the saloon's front window, a faded red kerchief tied at her throat, a journal open before her but never written in. Her eyes, dark and far off, followed the dust storms that rose over the chaparral like ghosts unburied. They said she stared at them like they owed her something, or had taken something from her they couldn't return. No one sat at her table, not even Most the piano man, who once tried to offer her a cup of coffee and got no answer, just the flat gaze of someone who's forgotten how to receive kindness without suspicion. Old Cora, who ran the saloon and had lost 3 husbands to different brands of foolishness, said the woman never asked for anything, never made trouble, and never answered questions. She just watched, as if waiting. By spring, folks had started to make stories of her, that she was touched by grief, that she'd slit her husband's throat in his sleep and burned the house with the body still in it, that she could see the future if you caught her eyes long enough, that she wasn't mad at all, just listening to things no one else could hear. Blackthistle was a place of short tempers and long silences. It lay low in a saddle of land between ridges, a town half-built and mostly dust. Men came there to mine or to vanish, to bury their names or find new ones. Women came trailing children and curses. It was no place to grow soft. So they gave the Quiet Widow her space, and when they spoke of her, it was with the wary edge folks save for wild dogs and ghosts. But the wind changed in the summer. A man came riding in from the south, lean as bone and sun-bitten. His horse was near spent, and he walked it the last mile into town, his boots hanging loose from the stirrups, his hat shadowing eyes that looked like they'd stopped sleeping years back. He didn't say much either, just asked for coffee and a place to sit. It was the middle of the week, mid-afternoon, when the saloon was mostly empty but for flies and the smell of stale beer. The man nodded to Cora, dropped a coin on the counter, and turned around looking for a table. Every seat was open. Except one. He walked to the window where the Quiet Widow sat, paused, then settled across from her like a man too tired to second-guess the wind. She didn't look up, didn't flinch, didn't speak. Neither did he. They sat there, her with the closed journal and unblinking eyes, him with a tin cup steaming between his hands. The town saw it happen, and folks waited for her to rise or leave or vanish entirely. But she didn't. He stayed an hour, then 2. Then the sun dropped low behind the mesas and the flies thinned, and he got up, nodded once at her like he'd heard something worth keeping, and left. The next day he came again, sat again. No words passed between them. But something changed. The widow began bringing 2 cups to the table, one for her, untouched, one for him, always full. And he, this stranger with the bone-deep tiredness, began to linger. Sometimes he hummed under his breath, a low, near-forgotten tune. Sometimes he took out a knife and carved shapes into the table's edge, small things, mountains and rivers, a bird in flight. Still they didn't speak, but those who watched could feel it, something tethered forming between them, a thread pulled tight through silence. Then came the night a boy stumbled in from the edge of the desert, half-starved and wild-eyed, whispering about riders with fire in their wake, and a church burned to the bones. A night when Blackthistle would have to decide whether it was still a place worth defending. A night that would test what kind of strength lived inside silence, and whether 2 people, broken and unknown to each other, might be enough to save more than themselves. But all that was still ahead. For now, the woman who spoke to no one sat at her table in silence. And the man who had forgotten how to rest came to listen. The boy's name was Eli, though he couldn't say it for hours after they pulled him in from the road. He'd come stumbling out of the northern scrublands, feet bloodied, hands burned, lips split from thirst. Cora found him at dawn, crouched against the watering trough like a hunted thing, clutching a charred sliver of wood that might have once been a crucifix. They laid him out behind the bar, where the morning shade was cool and quiet. The Quiet Widow brought wet cloths without being asked. She knelt beside him, dipped her fingers in water, and wiped soot from the boy's eyes like it was a thing she'd done before, long ago. He flinched at first, but her touch was light, and her silence oddly merciful. The tired man, folks were calling him Harper now, though he never offered it, stood against the wall and watched. His coat was off, revealing the puckered line of an old bullet wound under his collarbone. He didn't move to help, just waited, arms crossed, like a man listening for something faint beneath all the noise. It was late afternoon before the boy could speak. "They lit it," Eli whispered. "The whole place. Preacher was still inside." Cora leaned close. "Who did, honey?" He shook his head. "Didn't know 4 riders, black coats, no markings, faces covered. Didn't want nothing, just watched it burn." Someone behind them spat. Mose muttered a prayer, low and broken. "What place?" asked Cora. "White Briars." A hush dropped like snow over the room. Whitebriar was a settlement 20 miles north, a scattering of cabins and a church with a copper bell. Folks there kept to themselves, but they traded every few weeks: cornmeal, smoked meat, soap. The idea that it was gone sat wrong with everyone. No warning, no reason. The boy fell into sleep like a man falling into a pit. He didn't wake that night. Cora told someone to ride out to the sheriff in La Grella, though they all knew he'd be slow to come and quicker to forget. By nightfall, half the town was murmuring behind closed doors. Some spoke of packing up. Others checked their rifles. Harper stayed in the saloon. So did the widow. They sat at their table while the wind clawed at the walls and oil lamps burned low. He carved a sparrow into the wood that night, sharp-winged and mid-flight. She didn't watch him do it, but her fingers traced the outline after he left. On the second morning, Eli woke in a sweat. He spoke more this time, in pieces. He'd been sleeping in the chapel loft when the riders came. Heard laughter below, boots on stone, then the sound of lanterns breaking. When he looked down, he saw fire licking the pews and the preacher standing still in the aisle, arms raised, not moving even as the flames took him. Harper listened without asking questions. But when the boy said he saw one of the riders turn back and look up, just for a second, Harper's face changed. "He had a scar," Eli said, "across his mouth, like someone tried to sew it shut." Harper stood and walked out into the dust without a word. The widow sat very still. Later that day, a wagon pulled in from the east. A family of 5, mother, father, 3 kids, faces ashen, wagon scorched. They'd passed Whitebriar too, nothing left but ash and bones. "They're movin'," said Cora, "and they ain't done." That evening, the townsfolk gathered in the saloon, uneasy and loud. No one wanted to be the one to say it, but fear did the talking anyway. "We ain't got enough guns. They won't stop. They want us afraid." Voices clashed like dull knives. And then the quiet widow stood. The room went still, not because of any sound, she said nothing, but because she moved to the center like it mattered. Her journal, that ever-empty book, she held to her chest. Her eyes were dark, steady. When she opened the cover, it revealed not blank pages, but maps, hand-sketched, careful, marked with routes and names and notations. She turned it outward. Someone gasped. Cora leaned in. It was a map of the entire basin. Trails, water holes, known hideouts, old cavalry posts long since abandoned. She had drawn them all. "She knows the land," Mose said. Harper stepped forward, his face unreadable. "Where'd you get this?" She looked at him. Her silence now had weight, not mystery. She tapped a place on the map, a canyon, tight and narrow, known to few. "A trap?" he asked. She didn't nod, but she didn't look away. For the first time, Harper smiled. Not much, just a corner of the mouth, something pulled from long disuse. "All right," he said, "then we give Emma welcome." And so the town, half-hearted and unready, began to gather itself around 2 quiet figures who spoke little but said everything. The widow, who hadn't spoken in months, became their guide. And Harper, the tired man, became their shield. But neither had told the whole of their past. And in the weeks to come, silence would have to carry more than just grief. It would have to carry truth. They made the plan by lantern light, seated at that scar-notched table where silence had once been refuge. Now it was counsel. The widow traced the canyon's contours with the tip of her knife. Her hands were calloused in the way of someone who'd known long miles and worse men. Harper sat beside her, back straight despite the weight he carried, eyes following every line she drew like it might tell him something about her that he hadn't yet guessed. Outside, Blackthistle stirred like a town waking from a dream of drowning. Doors were unlatched, guns cleaned, children hushed and held close. Every man and woman not crippled by age or fear came to listen, and though no speeches were made, something old and slow-moving took root, a will to endure. The canyon, she showed them, narrowed at the throat. A place where 4 riders could be drawn in and trapped, where rifles stationed on high ground could turn the land itself into a weapon. There was risk, but less than if they waited behind walls and prayed for mercy that would never come. They rode out in pairs under the cover of dusk. Harper led the first group, scouted the ridges, found old traces, bootprints, ash, a coil of rope left too carelessly behind. He moved like a man returning to something he'd once known too well, a soldier some guest, or worse. The widow stayed behind that first night, watching from the window with her journal open, not writing, just remembering. In the days that followed, she walked the town's perimeter at dawn, her steps sure. She mended broken hinges, tied knots in the fence wire, showed the younger ones how to signal with mirrors. Her voice remained locked behind her teeth, but her silence had turned from stillness to direction. Folks began to follow her not because she asked it, but because she showed them how. On the 4th day, Harper brought back a token. He laid it on her table without ceremony, a scrap of dark cloth, torn and scorched. She took it gently, turned it once in her palm, and then slid it into her journal. "There within 3 days, ride," he said, "maybe less." She nodded, slow. Cora began boiling water in the mornings and laying out bandages at night. The saloon's piano gathered dust. Most took to carving notches in the doorframe, one for each day without attack. That night, thunder cracked over the ridges. The next morning, a girl named Annie, barely 14, with a mind sharp as flint, asked the widow if she'd always known how to draw maps. The widow bent to the child's level, took her hand, and pressed a small compass into her palm. A gift, wordless. Annie blinked, then smiled and ran off to show her brothers. Cora watched it happen and wiped her eyes on her apron. The town was changing. And Harper, he felt it too. He found himself standing outside the widow's room come evening, hand hovering over the doorframe like it held heat. He didn't knock, didn't step inside, but he lingered. Once she opened the door and found him there, and neither of them spoke, but they stood together under the low light for a long time, and that said more than words could have. He didn't know why it mattered, only that it did. That she, who had lost so much she could no longer speak of it, might somehow still be willing to stay. On the 6th night, Harper couldn't sleep. He walked the ridge, rifle slung, eyes scanning stars and shadows. That's when he saw the firelight on the horizon. Not one fire, 4. Moving together. They were coming. When he returned, the widow was already waiting at the edge of town, journal in hand, rifle across her back. She looked at him like she had known, all along, the exact hour they would arrive. "They're close," he said. She nodded. Then, for the first time since she had come to Blackthistle, she spoke. Only 2 words. "I'm ready." Her voice was low, rough from disuse. It made Harper's breath catch, not from shock, but from the way it felt like something sacred, unearthed. He said nothing, just reached out and laid his hand over hers. And side by side, they walked into the dark, toward the canyon. Toward the reckoning. The canyon had no name on any map, not even in the widow's journal. It was a place known only to the wind and whatever bones lay forgotten beneath its shale. They reached it by dawn, the sky turning copper and rose behind them, the world too quiet for comfort. The widow led the way down the switchbacks. She wore her coat buttoned tight, the rifle across her shoulders moving with each careful step. Harper walked behind, guarding their trail, glancing often over his shoulder as though expecting something to rise from the rocks behind them. Neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer void but packed. They weren't alone. Mose had come, rifle over his back, the hymn singer now a lookout. Cora, too, rough-voiced and sunburnt, brought a satchel of bandages and bullets. Even young Annie followed on a mule, carrying signal mirrors and a sling, her face too solemn for her years. Others would arrive by nightfall, ranchers and miners, a mother who had lost her son to fever last winter and now looked like she wouldn't lose anything else again. They built no fires, laid no camp, just waited. Harper placed the sharpshooters along the ridgeline, posted the widow and the high crook overlooking the canyon's throat. She had a clear view of the narrow pass, where the rock walls funneled inward. She sighted her rifle on the point where the dust trail would rise first and then set it down beside her. Instead of watching, she wrote. Her journal, silent so long, now filled with words. She didn't write what was happening. She wrote what had already passed. The child she'd lost in a fire in Kansas. The man she had loved who left her during the drought of '69. The brother taken by a fever on the trail west. She wrote not for memory's sake, but for something deeper, for the setting down of weight, the naming of ghosts. Harper didn't read over her shoulder, though he sat beside her. He cleaned his rifle, hands steady, his thoughts on a man with a scar across his mouth. You've seen them before, the widow said. Her voice was low again, barely carried over the wind, not a question. Harper nodded, rode with M once, not by choice. She didn't press him. I left after they torched a farmhouse near Rio Arriba, woman and 3 sons inside. I told myself I didn't know what they'd do, but I did. I always did. He looked down at his hands, as if they might still carry the soot. They left me for dead in Utah, took my horse, my coat, thought it was justice, maybe it was. The widow didn't offer comfort, she didn't move, but after a time she tore a page from her journal and handed it to him, a map sketched in precise lines, escape routes, places to fall back to. She was telling him, whatever you've done, I see what you're doing now. That was enough. At dusk, they heard the horses. 4 riders, just as the boy had said, black coats, faces masked. One bore a long scar that pulled his mouth into a permanent sneer. They came fast, single file, careless in their arrogance. They thought Black Thistle would be like the others. They didn't know the land had turned against them. When the first rider entered the narrowest part of the gorge, Harper raised his hand. A glint of mirror from the high ridge, Annie's signal. Then the widow pulled the trigger. The lead rider went down without a sound. His horse scattered into the rock, screaming. The second fell next, a clean shot through the spine. The others turned, confused, too late. Mose's rifle barked from above. Cora fired twice from behind a rise. Harper rose, walked into the open, and leveled his weapon. The third rider turned to flee. But the last, the scarred one, dismounted slow, tossed his rifle aside, and stared directly up at Harper with a grin too cruel to be human. I knew you, crawl back, he called. Harper didn't answer. I seen your kind, the man went on. Try to buy penance with bullets, don't change what you did. The widow stepped into view. Scar's eyes flicked toward her, surprised. Who's this? Harper raised his rifle. The widow's voice came calm and hard. Justice. The shot rang clear and final. Scar staggered, not from Harper's gun but hers, straight through the heart. He fell without a word. And just like that, it was over. Dust settled, smoke cleared. The canyon fell silent again. They buried the dead where they fell, unnamed and unmourned. That night back in Black Thistle, they lit lanterns in every window. Not for mourning, for endurance. And for the first time in years, the widow sat at her table and spoke freely. Not much, but enough. And Harper listened, as he always had. Because some truths don't need telling all at once. Only honoring. The morning after the canyon fight, the wind came in gentle from the west, carrying the scent of juniper and new dust. For the first time since winter, the light in Black Thistle didn't feel like something to flinch from. It poured soft and golden over rooftops, touched the broken hitching posts and the warped porch rails with a kind of grace. The town woke slowly. No one rang bells, no one sang, but men rose and swept their thresholds. Women opened their shutters and fed chickens. A baby cried in the distance and someone laughed. Life, tentative and sore, took its first careful step forward. Harper was in the saloon, sleeves rolled, wiping blood from the butt of his rifle with a wet rag. He moved with the weariness of a man who had carried something too long and finally set it down. But he hadn't left town. That was the thing. Cora brought him coffee, didn't speak. He nodded his thanks, and she touched his shoulder once before walking away. Even she could feel it. Whatever had bound him to silence and wandering had loosened its grip. Outside, the widow stood beside the church bell, its bronze throat blackened with soot. She reached up with both hands and began to scrub, slow and steady. Annie brought a bucket of water and watched in silence. They worked side by side until the bell gleamed faintly under the morning sun, like it remembered its purpose. Word of the canyon had traveled already. A trap well laid, 4 men dead, no losses among the townfolk. And it was the widow they spoke of now, not in whispers, but in tones of awe. She knew the land better than anyone. Drew maps from memory. Didn't flinch once. Still, no one knew her name. That evening, she came into the saloon while Harper was cleaning his knife. She sat across from him, her journal closed and tied with a leather cord. "I buried the pages," she said. He looked up. "Which ones?" "The ones that held my ghosts. They're not coming with me." He didn't ask where she'd buried them. "You leaving?" he asked instead. She hesitated. "I thought I would." He nodded, waited. "I used to think silence was safety, that if I stayed quiet long enough, nothing else could be taken." Harper leaned back, let her speak. "But silence doesn't keep the world out, just keeps you alone in it." He smiled then, tired, quiet, but real. "You taught this town how to listen," he said. She looked down at her hands. "And you?" He took his time answering. "I thought I was only good for breaking things, that maybe I'd die doing something that looked like redemption." A pause passed between them, filled with the creak of the saloon's old boards and the whisper of wind through chinks in the walls. "But now," she asked. He looked at her like she was the end of a long trail. "Now I wonder if I can build something with someone." She didn't reply right away, just slid her journal across the table to him. "Write your maps next," she said. "I'll follow." And then she stood and walked into the night, not away, but toward the small house near the edge of town, the one with a stove that hadn't been lit in months, curtains that had never been drawn. A place waiting to become a home. He watched her go. And for the first time since he'd sat at that table, he picked up a pen. The seasons turned. Blackthistle held its breath through the first frost, expecting the wind to shift cruel again, expecting the old ghosts of violence to return. But winter passed clean. No fires on the horizon, no riders in black, just snow that fell soft and undisturbed across the roofs, and the sound of hammers fixing what had long gone unrepaired. They never came for her again, whoever they were. The canyon swallowed their bones and whatever vengeance they carried with them. The land took them as it takes all things. The widow, her name was Lark, they learned in pieces, stayed. Not all at once and not easily. Some mornings she'd vanish down the western trail with her rifle and not return until dusk, face wind-burned, eyes far off again. But she always came back, always to the same table in the saloon, always to Harper. He didn't press her when she left, just kept the coffee warm and the second cup waiting. There was a rhythm to it now, an understanding born not from explanation, but from presence, the kind that doesn't need to be named to be trusted. He took work repairing fences for the ranchers who hadn't fled, helped most rebuild the old stable, sat on porches with children who asked questions he never quite knew how to answer. And some nights, when the sky went indigo and the stars leaned close, he'd read aloud from the pages he'd started to write, maps of his own, stories buried beneath the silence of his years. Lark would listen with her hands folded in her lap, face still and unreadable. But afterward, she'd light the stove, pour 2 cups of coffee, and sometimes, only sometimes, she'd tell a piece of her story too. It wasn't healing, not exactly. But it was something like peace. One spring morning, a new family arrived in Blackthistle. A man, a woman, a baby wrapped in an old blue shawl. They had come from the south, fleeing something they wouldn't name. Lark met them at the edge of town. She showed them where to draw water, where the soil held promise. The woman looked at her with cautious hope. "Is it safe here?" Lark didn't answer right away. Just looked out over the town, its patched roofs, its worn fence lines, the saloon with a new bell above its door. "It can be," she said. And that was enough. That night Harper cooked beans over the stove. Lark stood by the window, watching the last of the light spill over the hills. There was laughter from the saloon. Somewhere, a fiddle playing low, the kind of song that didn't ask for anything but time. He handed her a plate, and she took it without comment. They sat on the floor, backs against the wall, sharing the quiet like a blanket. After a long while, she leaned her head against his shoulder. "I used to think no one would ever sit across from me again," she said, "that I'd be left staring at the door until the world forgot me." Harper turned slightly, just enough to rest his chin atop her hair. "You were never invisible," he said, "just waiting for someone who knew how to listen." They didn't kiss, they didn't need to. The silence between them said all there was. And outside, the town of Blackthistle breathed steady in the dark, held together not by law or luck, but by the quiet strength of those who had stayed. By those who knew that love, when it came, was not thunder, but a hand resting beside yours. A name spoken with care. A chair pulled out across from your own and left waiting.